to reference of some of the other talks we had about learning and few we had about design and creativity. So we here and there discussed the idea of how to become an expert and the 10,000 hours rule that sort of has been a bit debunked or whatever, and deliberate practice, which goes back to, new learnings about the science of how learning and the brain works. Many organizations really struggle to recruit and retain the right kind of experts or creative heads or problem solvers, let alone a whole team of them.
Mm-hmm.
How would you say, and if you can give some examples on, how today's teams could work in reference to some of the research you've been doing?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So as you point out, that 10,000 hours of deliberate practice research is, saying it's been debunked is, well, it's strong. I don't necessarily think it applies to this kind of question, especially expertise in the context of innovation. The original research, which I think was from the early 90s, was about people learning how to play a musical instrument. So it was about expertise where I guess the definition of the skill that needs to be developed is quite circumscribed. There's no kind of uncertainty about it. There's no emergence about knowing how to manipulate an instrument like a violin. There is uncertainty about what you produce with that instrument, but not about the physical embodied skill of using the violin. And I think for that kind of expertise, definitely if you invest a lot of time, you learn the affordances of the tool and of the material, and you become very good at doing what you're doing in that context. Now, the question that you're posing is, you've got these teams of experts that are innovation teams. And your question, I guess, is how do you build teams that have the expertise of innovation? I would argue that this is a very different kind of expertise. From the perspective of how to build a team that can be expert at coming up with new ideas, especially ones that have never been had before, I would argue that the way you build it is not to go out and find necessarily a bunch of people who are very good at one thing. Here's another person who's very good at another thing, even though that is important. The most important thing is figuring out how you bring all these people who are good at what they do together with each other in a way that allows every person who is a part of the team to understand what the other people bring to the team and how they can work together. So that process of team integration and exploring what individual members of the team are good at and what they want to do, that's really, really hard. And I would say, if I take examples from the culinary R&D teams that I worked with, one way that managers and leaders can do this is simply by changing the way they bring people into these teams in the first place. So one of the things that conventional HR practice does when you're trying to hire into a new team is you define the job scope, you write a very detailed job description, and then you go out and you try and find people who match that job description. And when you do the interviews and do the other evaluations to figure out who you're actually going to hire, you try and pick people who match that job description the best. I don't think this works for innovation because the definition of innovation is that you have no idea what you're trying to do. You just know that it has to be new, and you have to figure out as you're doing it whether this new thing is actually good. In a situation like that, a clear and stable job description makes absolutely no sense. How will you know in advance what people need to do if you don't know what it is that they need to produce? So if you are a leader and you're trying to build an innovation team, instead of going through the conventional human resources process of putting out a job description and then recruiting and then interviewing, the better thing to do might be what I call negotiated joining in the context of open-ended roles. So you might say to people who might be a member of your R&D team or your innovation team, come join us for a few months, during which time possibly you can even pay them a pro rata full-time salary. And during this time, some part of your job that we know needs to be done will be clearly specified, but a bit of your job, 10%, 20%, we don't know, is something that we don't know at all. And you should help us figure that out by trying things out and showing us what you're trying out and trying to convince us that it's good for us and good for you. If you want a very concrete example, this is basically what Google's 20% time is supposed to be. And historically, in some cases, 20% time does result in actually really interesting things that would not have been done if 20% time didn't exist. So it's not just in the kind of, high-end culinary R&D teams that this idea of a provisional role that is open-ended, that is then developed using negotiated joining exists. In fact, this idea of percentage time has been in place for many decades even. I think 3M was the first company that did something like that a while ago. So yeah, so I think that's one way that you can build a team that works in a way that is expert as a team. There will probably have to be people who have expertise inside, but they don't all need to be experts in the way that the 10,000 hours research says expertise works. So that was a very circuitous answer, I guess, and I hope it kind of addresses some of the questions that you had in relation to that.